Hey everyone, welcome to Splash, or Stopping Plastic and Litter Along Shorelines. My name is Kelly, and today we're going to be talking about ecosystems and specifically the Galveston Bay ecosystem and how even if you live miles and miles away from the Galveston Bay, you're actually a lot closer than you might think. All right, so let's take a look at what we're going to be covering today. First, we'll actually define what a watershed is and what an ecosystem is. And then with those definitions, we'll dive into the kinds of ecosystems and species that we actually find in the Galveston Bay. And then last, we'll look at how healthy those ecosystems are and what impacts humans might be having on them. All right, so let's dive right into it. What is a watershed? No matter where you live, whether you're right on the bay or on the ocean or miles and miles away from any body of water, you live within a watershed. So what does that actually mean? A watershed is an area of land that drains rainfall and snowmelt to a central location, like a lake, a river, a bay, or an ocean. So that means when you're at home and it might be raining and you see rain coming off of your roof, or you see water flowing through the gutters on your street, all of that water is going to eventually end up in the same place. And that's true of the water coming off of your neighbors' houses and the water coming from your whole town, your whole community, and all the communities and towns around you. It's all going to drain through different pathways to one final destination, like a lake, a river, bay, or ocean. And so all of these different areas, all these towns and communities are interconnected. What that means is that even if you live really far away from the bay or the ocean, the water from your area is connected to the bay and the ocean. And so what happens in your area has an impact on the health of the animals in that bay or ocean. And so since we all live in a watershed, what watershed do we live in? How are we all connected? We are all connected by the Greater Galveston Bay watershed, which is a huge watershed. As you can see, it spreads all the way from Houston up to the Dallas-Fort Worth area and even a little bit farther. And there's some pretty cool fun facts about this watershed. So did you know that first, the Galveston Bay watershed is 24,000 square miles, which is actually bigger than the entire state of Hawaii. And because it's so big, it actually includes a lot of people in Texas. And it's actually half of the entire population of Texas lives within the Galveston Bay watershed, which is kind of cool if you think about it, because it means if you live in this watershed, you have a connection to half of all of the people living in the entire state of Texas. So we'll talk more about this interconnectivity and what that means for our ecosystems a little bit later, but just keep that in mind and keep in mind how connected we all are through this watershed. All right, so now that we know what a watershed is, let's take a look at what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. So we can kind of break that down into two different parts, the biological community and the physical environment. And when we talk about ecosystems, there's two things that we usually talk about. The first is the biotic factors, which is the biological community, the things that are living. And then the abiotic factors, which is the physical environment, the things that aren't living. So what are some examples of these two different groups? Well, biotic factors can include birds, seagrasses, and other plants. So basically anything that you might think of that is living, like birds, plants, fish, all of those living things. Abiotic factors include things like sunlight, the temperature, wind, rain, or the sediment and the rocks and the soil that is in the environment. So you have the living things and you have the non-living things, and both of those come together to create an ecosystem. So what's an example of an ecosystem? My favorite are coral reefs. They're super vibrant. There's tons and tons of living things, tons and tons of biotic factors, the fish, the corals, the crabs, the sharks, all kinds of living things. There's also really important abiotic factors like the saltwater that has a certain temperature, has a certain salinity, the sunlight that keeps the corals alive. So both of those biotic and abiotic factors are really important in this ecosystem. Another ecosystem you might think of is a grassland where you have grasses and shrubs and trees, as well as gazelle and buffalo and zebras and all those living things. And then you also have the sunlight and the rain and the soil that keeps all of those plants alive. So you really need both the biotic and the abiotic factors to make this whole ecosystem. But when we think about this definition, a biological community of interacting organisms in their physical environment, we can talk about a specific ecosystem, one ecosystem like a coral reef or like a grassland. But what if we look at a bigger picture? If we think about it, the whole Earth is really an ecosystem, right? The whole planet is a biological community of interacting organisms. So humans, animals, plants, all the living things on this planet, and their physical environment, which is our Earth, our planet. So when we talk about ecosystems, we can really look at different scales. We can look at one individual coral reef, or we can zoom all the way out to the entire planet. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about the Galveston Bay, but just remember that you can define ecosystems on different scales. There are a couple other important terms to know when we talk about ecosystems. The first is biodiversity. So what's that? The variety of life in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And biodiversity is really, really important to ecosystems. And why is it so important? Because it creates resilience to change. And what that means is that high biodiversity allows an ecosystem to recover if there's a change or a disturbance. So when you have lots and lots of different types of species, you have lots of different types of fish, different types of birds, different types of plants, all of those different species mean that you have very high biodiversity. And when you have high biodiversity, you're going to be more resilient to a natural disturbance like maybe a hurricane or a wildfire, or maybe a human-caused disturbance like pollution or some other impact that humans may cause. So let's look at an example of how this works in real life. Here we have an example of a coral reef. This is a little oversimplified, but this just gives you an idea of the types of critters that you'll find on a coral reef ecosystem, which, like I said, is my favorite. So at the very top, you have the sharks, the apex predators. They are the very top of the food web, and you have 4 different species of sharks here. And then below them, you have the mesopredators, or the predators that are sort of in the middle of the food web. They're not quite at the top like the sharks are, but they're not down at the bottom either. So they're somewhere in the middle. And you have lots of different species of fish in this category, like grouper and snapper and stingrays. And then below that, you have the herbivores, so the fish that eat things like algae, they eat plants. So you have parrotfish and angelfish and surgeonfish. And then at the very bottom, you have the corals. And the corals really make up the whole structure of this ecosystem. They provide the habitat for all of these species. And they also provide food for the herbivores because algae grows on coral and those herbivores will eat that algae. So here we have a very biodiverse coral reef. We have lots of different species of sharks and fish, lots of different species of corals. So let's see what happens if we introduce a disturbance or a change into this ecosystem. So one example we can think of is humans like to catch fish and eat fish, right? And snapper are a pretty popular fish that humans like to eat. So something called overfishing might happen, which is where humans catch too many of a type of fish and then they disappear from the ecosystem. So if we imagine that this might happen with snapper, we would lose the snapper from our ecosystem. But if we just lose the snapper, obviously it's not great, but there isn't a lot of impact to the rest of the ecosystem because there's lots of biodiversity, there's lots of other species to fill that role that we lose from that snapper. What if we lost the grouper? The grouper are also a pretty popular fish to catch and eat. Now, if we lose the grouper, we might start to see some impacts. Now that we've lost multiple species of fish, we might see the population of herbivores actually increase because there are fewer mesopredators preying on them, so they can actually reproduce more and produce more of them. And because we have more herbivores, they actually might start to cause some damage to the coral reef from overeating and overgrazing on the algae. So we might lose a little bit of coral. But for the most part, our ecosystem stays pretty healthy. And because we had this high biodiversity, it likely over time will go back to its original healthy levels with lots of species and lots of biodiversity. One other example we can try is coral disease. So that's something that naturally occurs. It's not necessarily human caused. And sometimes it impacts just one specific type of coral, kind of like a flu or a virus. So imagine that there's a coral disease that impacts brain coral. So we'd lose that brain coral, but luckily we have all these other species of coral that maintain habitat for the rest of these species and food for our herbivorous fishes. So overall, this ecosystem is not going to be too vulnerable to changes and disturbances because it has really high biodiversity. Now let's look at a different ecosystem. Here is a coral reef ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of biodiversity, right? Because we only have a few types of each level of the food web. And so this ecosystem is not as healthy and it's not going to be as resilient to change over time. So what happens if we have that same coral disease come and impact the brain coral in this ecosystem? Well, we're probably going to lose a lot of the coral, if not all of it. And that means we lose habitat and food for our herbivorous fishes. So we're going to lose a lot of our parrotfish. And then we lose habitat and prey for our mesopredators, for our grouper. So we're not going to have as many of those either. And then that means there's not as much food for our sharks at the very top of the food web. So we're probably going to lose some sharks as well. And now this ecosystem looks totally different than it did when we started because of one impact. So that's why biodiversity is so important. It really helps keep an ecosystem in balance so that if there are any disturbances or changes, whether they're natural or human caused, the ecosystem can stay in balance, especially over the long term. It allows the ecosystem to recover. If you don't have high biodiversity, it's much more vulnerable and much more likely to suffer impacts from disturbances that will last for a long time, and it won't recover as well. So we've talked about biodiversity, and now we want to talk about one other term that is really important to think about when we talk about ecosystems, and that is ecosystem services. And you might be able to guess what that means from the name, but the definition is the benefits that people obtain from natural ecosystems. And there are so many benefits that we obtain from natural ecosystems. Here are just a few, and you can break them into four different categories. You don't have to remember these. It's just one way to try and group them in your brain if you want to. But some of the things that we get from ecosystems include the food we eat, the water we drink, the clean air we breathe, the species that we enjoy seeing when we go out fishing or birding or anything we do outside that's recreation. There are so many important things that we get from natural ecosystems, and humans really depend on those, even sometimes if we don't realize it. So we'll talk about these ecosystem services a little bit more later when we talk about the Galveston Bay ecosystems and the services that they provide directly to us. So we've talked about the watershed as a whole, and because it's such a big watershed, there's going to be lots and lots of different types of ecosystems that fall within that watershed. But we're going to zoom in a little more closely on the Galveston Bay. And obviously, like we said earlier, everything's connected. So the ecosystems that you'd find near Fort Worth or Dallas are really, really important too. But we're just going to focus a little bit more closely on what we would find in the Galveston Bay. And so the Galveston Bay itself is an estuary. And what that means is it is where freshwater and saltwater meet. It's a partially enclosed coastal water body where freshwater from rivers and streams and bayous mix with the saltwater that you get from the ocean. So estuaries and their surrounding area are places where you transition from the land and freshwater to the sea and saltwater. And estuaries are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the entire planet. You find an incredible number of living things in estuaries. And something that's pretty cool about our Galveston Bay estuary is that it's the biggest estuary in Texas, and it's the 7th biggest estuary in the United States. So it's a really, really important estuary. It's incredibly biodiverse, and it's a really dynamic ecosystem. And part of that is because of the changing levels of freshwater and saltwater. So in an estuary, you have a mix of fresh and salt water like we talked about, and that mix is constantly changing. So if you think about it, when something like a storm or a hurricane comes along, you might get storm surge, which causes the sea levels to rise and the salt water goes farther inland than it usually would on a regular day without storm surge. And then after a big rainstorm or after a big hurricane, you get lots of fresh water collecting in those gutters and rivers and streams and bayous, and collecting into the Galveston Bay. And so now the bay, rather than being a mix of fresh and salt water or mostly salt water, it has a lot of fresh water in it, as those land sources of fresh water all empty into the Galveston Bay. So you have a constantly changing mix of fresh water and salt water, which makes it a really unique ecosystem. And it doesn't even require such a big event like a rainstorm or a hurricane for this mix to happen. Even just on a daily basis, as the tides rise and fall, your mix of freshwater and saltwater is going to be changing. So some of the ecosystems that we find in the Galveston Bay include freshwater wetlands, saltwater wetlands, seagrass beds, and oyster reefs. And we can talk about the Galveston Bay as a whole ecosystem, as an estuarine or estuary ecosystem. And like we said, we can define ecosystems on different scales. So we can look at the bay as a whole, as one big ecosystem, but we can also zoom in a little more closely on these more individual ecosystems that have slightly different roles that they play within the estuary. And so even though these are all connected and all part of our larger Galveston Bay estuary ecosystem, we're going to look at these a little bit more closely on an individual level. First, we'll talk about freshwater and saltwater wetlands. We'll actually talk about these together because they are kind of similar. But as you can guess from the name, one is freshwater and one is mostly saltwater. So wetlands are really the transition between land and aquatic or watery environments. You get a mix of water levels. Sometimes the water level is higher with the tides, and sometimes it's really low and it's dry because the tide is low. So you get a mix of both wet and dry in these ecosystems. With freshwater ecosystems, you'll find them a little bit more inland, where you mostly have freshwater, whereas saltwater wetlands are sometimes called fringing wetlands because they exist right along the border of the land and the salty body of water like the bay or the ocean. These ecosystems, like the whole estuary, really experience a lot of change in their water salinity, whether it's freshwater or saltwater or a mix of the two, with tides and storms and things like that, like we talked about earlier, which means they have really well-adapted organisms that can survive a lot of different types of environments because it's constantly changing. They offer some really important ecosystem services. So first of all, they are natural water filters, meaning a lot of the water that runs from our watershed into the Galveston Bay is sometimes polluted because it comes from roads and cities where different types of pollutants or chemicals are entering the water, and also dirt and other things like that. And so these wetlands can actually collect those pollutants and collect those dirts and sediments and trap them in the wetlands before they get out to the rest of the bay. So they help keep the rest of the bay a little bit cleaner by filtering the water as it comes from the land and enters the ocean or the bay. Another really important ecosystem service they provide is they act as storm buffers. So when storm surge comes or really strong waves come, the wetlands actually help to block those waves or soak up that storm surge so that our communities are more protected when there is a storm. So they're really, really important to keep our communities safe. And then last but not least, they also are really great at preventing erosion. And erosion is when the water starts to wash away some of the land. And so when you have waves and tides and storm surge and things like that, the land can start to disintegrate and wash into the bay or the ocean. And wetlands stop that from happening by trapping all of that dirt and all of that sediment and that land with the roots from the plants that grow in wetlands. And so they're really good at keeping the shoreline stable so that it doesn't erode into the body of water. So again, that protects our communities as well. And last, they are really great habitats for fish, birds, and tons of other wildlife. Just like the estuaries are super highly biodiverse ecosystems, but they're particularly good habitat for juvenile or young organisms that use the wetlands as a place to hide from larger predators and use the wetland as a place to eat and grow before they maybe move out into a different ecosystem once they become adults. So some of the organisms you might find here are blue crabs or fish like flounder or redfish, and some birds include roseate spoonbills, ibises, and blue herons and other egrets and things like that. So this is just a small sample of some of the things you'll find in wetlands because they are so biodiverse. Next, we'll look at seagrass beds. So seagrass beds you'll typically find in shallow, clear waters where they have access to sunlight, because just like plants on land, seagrass, which grows in the water, requires sunlight to photosynthesize. And so they have to grow in pretty shallow water and in water that's pretty clear so the sunlight can reach the blades of grass and they can photosynthesize. They are usually found in salty water, but can also live in brackish, which means a mix of fresh and salt water. And so that's why they are really great in these estuarine ecosystems where you have a mix of fresh and salt water. Some of the ecosystem services they provide include water filtration, just like our wetlands. They can help trap sediments and other things like that in the soil and make the water much clearer, which is really great for the ecosystem as a whole. And they're an important part of different nutrient cycles. So because they photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide and they take in sunlight and they store that carbon and they put oxygen, they release oxygen into the water, which is really, really important for all the fish and other aquatic organisms that live in the water. So they're a really important part of that cycle as well. And they also prevent erosion, just like wetlands, by trapping the sediment with their roots as they grow in the underwater sediment. And last, they are, again, vital habitat for juvenile fish and invertebrate species. You'll find tons and tons of different organisms in seagrass beds, but again, particularly juvenile organisms that will use this ecosystem to hide and grow until they become larger and can start preying on other juvenile organisms. So some of the things you'll find here are bay scallops or shrimps or maybe juvenile sea trout, or you'll find larger organisms that are preying on these smaller organisms. So again, a really biodiverse ecosystem when it's healthy, and lots of different things spend time either living here or hunting here or whatever it may be. And last but not least, we have oyster reefs. Oyster reefs are really, really cool. So oysters, you can find them growing on just about anything. If you've ever spent time around the Galveston Bay or other salty bodies of water, you may have seen oysters growing on piers or on bricks, or sometimes even on other critters. You can find them growing on sea turtles sometimes, or crabs. They will grow just about anywhere. But their favorite place to grow is on other oysters. And so when you get a bunch of oysters that grow on top of each other, they create an underwater structure, just like a coral reef, but instead of the corals making the structure, it's actually the oysters making the structure. It's almost like they make an underwater city, and that structure they build creates habitat for tons of other organisms that hide in the nooks and crannies of the oyster reef. You'll find oyster reefs in mostly saltwater environments, but some brackish, because like we said, the estuary is a mix of fresh and saltwater. And they provide, like I said, habitat for so many other species. And the other major ecosystem service they provide is the fact that they are some of the best water filtration systems in the whole world. A single oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per day because they're filter feeders, which means in order to eat, they actually filter water through their bodies, they collect the nutrients in the water, and then they release clean water out. So while they're eating, they're also creating cleaner water for us to enjoy and for other organisms that live on oyster reefs and the whole estuary to enjoy. So they're really, really amazing organisms. Just by eating and feeding themselves, they make the whole ecosystem a cleaner and healthier place. And of course, last but not least, they're really delicious. Maybe you don't like eating oysters, but lots and lots of people love eating oysters. And that means there's a lot of jobs that depend on harvesting oysters and selling them and cooking them in restaurants. And so they're a really big part of our coastal economy. So not only do they provide habitat and keep our water clean, but they also provide jobs for lots of humans that live along the coast. So here are some examples of what oyster reefs can look like. There's just a big collection of oysters that create this underwater habitat, but it sometimes can be exposed if the tide is low, and you'll find birds and other organisms hunting along the oyster reef, looking for critters that may be hiding in the nooks and crannies. All right, so we just covered all of these ecosystems, and hopefully you're now just as excited as I am about these ecosystems and how important they are to our daily lives because of the services that they provide, and also really have an appreciation for all of the biodiversity in these ecosystems and all the organisms that call this area home. But it's important to remember, like we've talked about all along, that this is all connected. And so even though we talked about these ecosystems separately, they are really important together to keep the entire estuary healthy and the entire Galveston Bay healthy. So some of the species that we see in seagrass beds also spend time on oyster reefs or in wetlands and vice versa. And some species actually spend their juvenile or younger years in these ecosystems and then make their way out to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's actually connected to the ocean as well. So it's really important to remember that, we can talk about these ecosystems on an individual level, but at the end of the day, they're all connected. They all work together to keep our entire bay and even the Gulf of Mexico healthy and balanced. All right, so we've talked about all of these ecosystems and what they look like if they're healthy and what organisms you'll find there when they're healthy. But let's look at how healthy they actually are in the Galveston Bay and what impacts humans may be having on them. Let's look at freshwater and saltwater wetlands. Unfortunately, over the last 70 years or so, we've lost a lot of our wetlands, especially freshwater wetlands in the Galveston Bay region. And we really need these wetlands all around the bay to provide the full ecosystem services that we talked about, the storm surge protection, the flooding protection, the erosion prevention. All of that really depends on us having all the healthy ecosystems, all the healthy wetlands we possibly can. And the reason we're mainly losing wetlands is because of pollution from runoff from our cities and roads. Even though they are great water filtration systems, there's only a certain amount of pollution they can take before they start feeling the impacts of that pollution, and that starts impacting the organisms that live in wetlands. The other reason we lose wetlands is because of human activity, such as construction and recreation. A lot of times wetlands are cleared or filled so that we can build new buildings, or human recreation, such as driving on wetlands or fishing in wetlands. Sometimes that can impact the ecosystem itself. So we really have to pay attention to how our activities can impact wetlands and maybe even cause them to disappear. Next, we'll look at seagrass beds. There's been a pretty extensive loss of seagrass beds as well. In this map, you can see the orange is where we used to have seagrass beds many decades ago, and the green is where we find them today. So not quite as much area is covered by seagrass beds as it used to be. And that's largely because, again, pollution from runoff from our cities and roads and agriculture can really have an impact by making the water less clear, which means seagrass isn't able to get that sunlight that it needs to photosynthesize. And it can also, the chemicals and the harmful pollutants can just harm the seagrasses themselves. Human development activity, again, also has an impact. Sometimes we dredge areas of water so that it gets deeper so that boats can go through. And when that happens, it can kill the seagrass, or it can make it too deep for seagrasses to grow, because like we talked about, they really need shallow, clear water for sunlight to photosynthesize. And so these human activities can also have an impact on seagrasses. The good news with seagrass is there's a lot of restoration efforts underway. There's lots of local organizations that are working on replanting native seagrass species to try and bring seagrass beds back to the Galveston Bay. So hopefully, as we move forward into the future, we'll have more and more seagrass, and we'll see more and more of this map covered by green. And last but not least, oyster reefs. Oyster reefs, unfortunately, also have seen some decline in recent years. And this is largely because of too much fresh water. So when we have a big storm like Hurricane Harvey that dumps a lot of fresh water into the Galveston Bay, that can really harm our oysters, because like we talked about, they need salt water, or at the very least brackish water, which is a mix of fresh and salt water, but they can't survive in just fresh water. So when we have a big rainstorm that empties a lot of fresh water into Galveston Bay, the oysters don't survive very well. And then sometimes when there's drought, that actually makes the Galveston Bay too salty. There's too much salt in the water in Galveston Bay, and so sometimes that can impact the oysters as well. The other thing that we have to consider is that sometimes humans over-harvest oysters. Like we talked about with our example of the ecosystem with the snapper and the grouper, the same thing can happen with oysters where we take too many from the environment and they're not able to reproduce fast enough to keep up with how fast we're harvesting them for our consumption. Luckily, Texas just created a new rule where we can grow oysters specifically for human consumption, so that will help protect the wild populations of oysters. But that's a new program, and so we really have to think about how many oysters we're harvesting so that we don't take too many. And there's lots of oyster reef restoration activities underway, which is more good news for oysters. Lots of organizations are working with local restaurants to collect old oyster shells because, like we learned, oysters love to grow on other oysters. And so they take those old oyster shells and actually put them back in the Galveston Bay to encourage the growth of more and more wild natural oysters. And so hopefully with those efforts, we'll see more oyster reefs returning to the Galveston Bay. So that gives you a really broad overview of what ecosystems and watersheds are generally, and then what ecosystems we have here in the Galveston Bay. So let's take a look at what we learned. We talked about what a watershed is and how we all live in a watershed, and here we all live in the Galveston Bay watershed. And we talked about what an ecosystem is. It's both the living or biotic parts of the ecosystem and the physical environment or the abiotic parts of the ecosystem. We talked about what kind of ecosystems you find in Galveston Bay and what species you find here. So the freshwater wetlands and the saltwater wetlands, the oyster reefs and the seagrass beds. And then we looked at how healthy those ecosystems are and what impacts humans have on them. For the most part, almost all of those ecosystems are definitely suffering a lot of impacts right now, but there's a lot of really great work being done to recover the ecosystem. So we can't lose hope that these ecosystems will recover, that will restore their biodiversity so that they're more resilient to change in the future, and that will have a healthy Galveston Bay and estuary for many years to come. So what are some of the ways that you can help the Galveston Bay and the ecosystems in Galveston Bay? Some of the best ones that we like to share are volunteering with local organizations that restore seagrasses or restore wetlands or oyster reefs. There's lots of opportunities for the public to get involved and provide manpower to make these restoration activities happen. You also can recreate responsibly. So when you go to the beach or you go to the Galveston Bay, make sure you're being really careful with the ecosystems that you're spending time in and not disrupting either the organisms that live there or the physical environment that supports those organisms. You can also advocate for responsible development and avoid damage to our important ecosystems. So we can really advocate for our city to develop in a more sustainable and responsible way that keeps our ecosystems healthy. You can eat responsibly harvested oysters and recycle their shells to create new oyster reefs. Maybe you don't like eating oysters, but you can tell other people to eat responsibly harvested oysters. You can use eco-friendly products in your home and in your garden, or talk to your family about using eco-friendly products, because like we said, all of the water from our home could eventually end up in the Galveston Bay. So if we're using eco-friendly products that don't have harmful chemicals or other pollutants in them, that can keep our ecosystems healthier. And last, share this knowledge with other people. Take what you learned today, tell your friends and tell your family so that we're all working together to keep these ecosystems healthy. Thanks so much for watching this lesson with S.P.L.A.Sh. We hope you learned a lot about the ecosystems of the Galveston Bay and feel motivated to protect them and restore them and protect all the organisms that call the Galveston Bay watershed home.